Before the echoes of prophecy, before the clash of empires, and long before the hallowed ground became a stage for three of the world's great faiths, the land we now call the Holy Land was simply a land of stone and sun, of shifting dunes and fertile valleys. Its story is not one of a single person, but a vast and intricate tapestry woven from the threads of countless generations. It is a story told not just in the pages of sacred texts, but in the silent stones of ancient ruins, in the strata of archaeological digs, and in the whisper of the wind over timeless landscapes. This is a chronicle of a place that stands at the very nexus of history, a fragile bridge between continents, a crucible where human ambition, faith, and survival were forged in the furnace of time. From the dawn of recorded history, this small strip of land has been an irresistible prize, a strategic jewel coveted by every major power that has risen and fallen. Its very geography, a narrow corridor connecting the great civilizations of Mesopotamia and Egypt, destined it to be a highway for armies, traders, and ideas. Here, the gods of the Nile met the gods of the Euphrates, and their stories, their art, and their technologies blended into a new, unique culture. The earliest nomadic peoples, drawn by the promise of fertile crescent lands, saw in its hills and coasts not just a home, but a future. They built the first mud brick villages, domesticated the first grains, and laid the foundations for a way of life that would endure for millennia. Their lives were dictated by the seasons, by the rise and fall of rivers, and by the immutable rhythm of the cosmos. Their beliefs were tied to the land, to the spirits of the trees and the fertility of the soil, a primal faith that would later give way to more complex theological systems. This is where the story begins. In a time shrouded by the mists of prehistory, where the first flickers of human consciousness transformed into the first organized societies. The air was thick with the scent of wild thyme and the promise of rain, and the future was an unwritten scroll. We will journey through the rise of agricultural communities, the invention of writing, and the birth of a pantheon of gods. We will watch as small, independent city-states become the battlegrounds of colossal empires, as the Hittites, Egyptians, and Assyrians vie for control of this vital land. We will explore the lives of ordinary people, the farmers toiling in their fields, the merchants haggling in the bustling markets, the priests performing their ancient rites. Their hopes, their fears, and their dreams are the real heart of this epic. This is not a static history, but a living, breathing narrative of change and continuity. The land remembers every footstep, every battle cry, and every prayer. Its story is our story, a testament to the enduring human spirit in its quest for meaning, for belonging, and for a place in the sun. This is the chronicle of a place that has seen the very best and the very worst of humanity, a land forever marked by its extraordinary past. It is a story that, once begun, demands to be heard to its very end. In the twilight of the Stone Age, a profound transformation began to sweep across the Fertile Crescent, an arc of land that cradled the earliest stirrings of human civilization. The sun-baked hills and green valleys of the Holy Land, a crucial part of this cradle, were not yet known by that name, but were already becoming a stage for humanity's most significant leap. It was here, around 10,000 BCE, that the transition from a nomadic hunter-gatherer existence to settled agricultural life began to take root. People, who for countless generations had roamed the earth in search of sustenance, began to put down roots of a different kind, literally. They learned to cultivate wild grains like wheat and barley, understanding that by planting seeds they could ensure a stable food supply, a revolutionary concept that fundamentally altered the human condition. This newfound ability to produce food in one place led to the creation of the first permanent settlements. The small, semi-nomadic camps of the Natufian culture gave way to larger, more organized villages. They built circular or oval houses from mud and stone, structures that were more than just shelters. They were homes, testaments to a new way of life centered on community and stability. The development of agriculture was not merely a change in diet. It was the birth of social complexity. With a surplus of food, not everyone needed to be a farmer or hunter. Specialization emerged. Some individuals became skilled toolmakers, crafting flint blades and grinding stones with a precision previously unknown. Others became weavers, turning wild flax into rudimentary cloth. Still others took on the role of leaders or spiritual figures, interpreting the rhythms of the seasons and the mysteries of the natural world. This was the dawn of a new social hierarchy, the very first stirrings of what would one day become a state. As these early villages grew, they faced new challenges that required innovative solutions. The need for water was paramount, especially in a land where rainfall could be unpredictable. They learned to dig wells and construct rudimentary cisterns to store precious rainwater, a triumph of early engineering that ensured their survival through dry seasons. These technological advancements, born of necessity, created a virtuous cycle of growth and complexity. With a stable food supply and a growing population, villages blossomed into towns. By the Chalcolithic period, around 4500 to 3500 BCE, we see evidence of more sophisticated societies. The site of Tel el-Gassil in the Jordan Valley offers a glimpse into this world. Its large rectangular houses, with elaborate wall paintings and evidence of sophisticated crafts, suggest a society with a developed artistic and religious life. The people of this era worked with copper, the first metal to be widely used, marking a new technological age. They created distinctive pottery and carved beautiful cultic objects, reflecting a belief system deeply intertwined with the forces of nature and fertility. The rise of these towns led to increased trade, as communities exchanged goods like obsidian, seashells, and copper over long distances. This trade was not just an economic activity. It was a vector for the exchange of ideas, technologies, and beliefs, connecting these nascent communities to the wider world of the ancient Near East. The true leap into urban life came with the early Bronze Age, around 3300 to 2000 BCE. This was the era of the Canaanites, a people who would dominate the region for over a millennium. The Canaanites were not a unified empire, but a collection of independent city-states, each with its own king, gods, and agricultural lands. They were formidable builders, constructing massive fortified cities on hills, with thick stone walls and imposing gates. These cities, such as Megiddo, Jericho, and Hazor, were centers of power, commerce, and culture. They were vibrant, bustling places where thousands of people lived, worked, and worshipped. The archaeological record reveals a world of monumental architecture, intricate pottery, and sophisticated bronze tools and weapons. Life in a Canaanite city was a tapestry of daily rituals and hard work. Farmers would leave the city walls each morning to tend their fields of wheat, barley, olive groves, and vineyards. Inside the city, artisans would work in their shops, crafting goods for trade or for the local elite. In the city's temples, priests and priestesses would conduct ceremonies to honor their pantheon of gods, a rich and complex array of deities often led by the high god El and his consort Ashura, and the powerful storm god Baal. Their religion was a reflection of their agricultural society, a constant appeal to the divine forces that controlled the rain, the harvest, and the fertility of their land. The Canaanite cities were hubs of international trade, participating in a vast network that stretched from Egypt to Mesopotamia. They were a crucial link in the trade of timber from the forests of Lebanon, olive oil, and wine. This prosperity, however, came at a price. Their strategic location made them targets for the expansionist ambitions of the great empires of the time. The Egyptians, with their vast wealth and organized armies, periodically sought to control this land, seeing it as a vital buffer zone and a source of valuable resources. The Canaanites found themselves caught in a geopolitical vice, constantly navigating between the colossal powers to their north and south. Despite these external pressures, the Canaanite civilization flourished, leaving an indelible mark on the region. They developed an early form of writing, a cuneiform script that would later evolve into the alphabet. They laid the groundwork for the urban and social structures that would define the land for centuries to come. Their gods, their customs, and their way of life became the bedrock upon which subsequent cultures would build. This was a world of mud, brick, and bronze, where kings ruled from their fortified palaces and common people prayed for a bountiful harvest. It was a time of immense creativity and conflict, a vibrant civilization that, in its very DNA, carried the seeds of all that was to follow. It was the end of one era and the confident beginning of another. The ancient Canaanites, in their villages and cities, were the first to call this land home, and their legacy, though often overshadowed, is a foundational chapter in its eternal story. The vibrant tapestry of the Canaanite world, so carefully woven over centuries of trade and urban life, began to fray and unravel around the late 13th century BCE. It was a time of immense, cataclysmic change, a period that historians now call the Bronze Age collapse, a mysterious and dramatic end to an entire epoch. Across the eastern Mediterranean, the great palaces and powerful empires that had dominated for generations, the Mycenaeans of Greece, the Hittites of Anatolia, and the new kingdom of Egypt, crumbled into dust. Trade routes that had once been the lifelines of civilization suddenly went silent. The reasons for this widespread devastation remain one of history's great enigmas, a puzzle of interconnected disasters. Was it climate change, bringing years of drought and famine? Was it a wave of internal social unrest and rebellion, as the common people rose against their rulers? Or was it the relentless and brutal pressure from marauding groups, collectively known to the Egyptians as the Sea Peoples? The answer, most likely, is a complex and tragic combination of all these factors, a perfect storm that brought an entire world to its knees. In the Holy Land, the effects were immediate and profound. The great Canaanite city-states, which had stood as symbols of power and prosperity, were sacked and burned. The mighty walls of Hazor, a city of monumental temples and palaces, were torn down in a fire so fierce that it fused the very stones. Megiddo, Lachish, and others suffered similar fates, their bustling marketplaces and grand residences reduced to smoldering ruins. The sophisticated urban culture that had defined the region for a millennium vanished, leaving a power vacuum in its wake. This period was not one of total emptiness, but of profound transition. From the chaos emerged new players and new identities, forged in the crucible of collapse. Along the southern coast, a powerful and enigmatic group known as the Philistines settled. The Philistines, who were almost certainly part of the mysterious Sea Peoples, arrived in large numbers, bringing with them a distinct material culture that was markedly different from the Canaanites. Their pottery was unique, decorated with intricate motifs of birds and ships, and they were masters of ironworking, a technology that was just beginning to replace bronze. They established a powerful confederation of 5 major cities: Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Gath, and Ekron, and quickly became the dominant force in the coastal plain. Their presence was a major cultural and military challenge to the peoples living inland. While the Philistines were establishing their hold on the coast, another, equally significant, transformation was occurring in the Central Highlands. Archaeological surveys of this rugged, hilly terrain have revealed a dramatic increase in small, unfortified settlements in the late 12th and early 11th centuries BCE. These were not the grand city-states of the Canaanites, but humble villages, often built in terraces on the steep hillsides, with simple 4-room houses and evidence of a self-sufficient, agricultural lifestyle. Who were these people? They were a new, distinct group emerging from the rubble of the Bronze Age. The archaeological evidence, though not providing a name, paints a picture of a population that was less socially stratified than their Canaanite predecessors. Their pottery was simpler, they lacked the elaborate temples and palaces, and their burials were often in family plots rather than large, centralized cemeteries. This was the genesis of the people who would come to be known as the Israelites. The question of their origin is one of the most debated topics in biblical archaeology. Were they newcomers, arriving from outside the land, as the biblical narrative of the Exodus and conquest suggests? Or did they emerge from within, a group of dispossessed Canaanite peasants who moved away from the collapsing city-states and formed a new identity based on monotheistic belief and a shared tribal heritage? This information has not been verified. Scholars today tend to favor a synthesis of these ideas, suggesting a multifaceted origin. It is likely that some groups may have migrated into the region, while others were indigenous Canaanites who, for social, economic, or religious reasons, separated themselves from their old way of life. The unifying factor was not a single point of origin, but a new religious identity centered on the worship of a single deity, Yahweh, a stark contrast to the polytheistic pantheon of the Canaanites. This nascent people organized themselves not as a centralized kingdom, but as a loose confederation of tribes. Each tribe, with its own territory and leadership, would come together in times of crisis, often led by charismatic military figures known as judges. These were not kings in the traditional sense, but temporary leaders who rose to prominence to repel external threats, such as the incursions of the Philistines. The stories of Deborah, Gideon, and Samson, preserved in later traditions, capture the spirit of this age of tribal conflict and emergent identity. The struggles between the Philistines and the early Israelites define this period. The Philistines, with their advanced iron technology and organized military, posed a constant threat to the highland villages. The Israelites, though technologically outmatched, were fiercely independent and relied on their rugged terrain and decentralized guerrilla tactics to survive. This was a long, protracted conflict that shaped the identity of both peoples, creating a sense of shared purpose and a defining other. The land was no longer a highway for empires, but a contested frontier where new peoples were vying for control, for territory, and for the right to build their own future. The story of this era is etched into the burnt layers of ancient cities, in the simple pottery of highland villages, and in the epic narratives that would one day become a cornerstone of a world religion. It was a time of immense challenge and creative renewal, where the old gods and empires had fallen, and a new people, with a revolutionary idea of one God, began to build their destiny from the ground up, on a foundation of humility, resilience, and faith. This period, known as the Iron Age, laid the groundwork for the most pivotal development in the history of the region, setting the stage for the rise of a unified kingdom and a people who would forever be intertwined with the destiny of the land itself. The era of the Judges, a time of decentralized tribal life and intermittent conflict, gave way to a new and inevitable reality. The constant, existential threat posed by the technologically superior and militarily organized Philistines became the catalyst for a radical change in the political structure of the Israelite tribes. They could no longer rely on charismatic, temporary leaders to repel a persistent enemy. The disparate tribes, united by a common faith but divided by geography and rivalries, began to see the urgent need for a unified, centralized power. This was the birth of the United Monarchy, a seismic shift that would forever alter their destiny and lay the groundwork for a true national identity. The first king to answer this call was Saul, a tall and commanding figure from the tribe of Benjamin. His rise was a direct response to a Philistine attack on an Israelite city. He was not born into royalty, but was chosen by the people to be a military leader, a king in the most rudimentary sense. Saul's reign was a tumultuous one, a constant struggle to consolidate power and fend off the Philistines. He managed to unite the tribes for battle and achieved some initial successes, but his kingdom remained fragile, perpetually on the defensive. He laid the foundation for a professional army and a nascent administrative structure, but his rule was defined by instability and a tragic end, setting the stage for the true architect of the kingdom. The mantle of leadership would pass from Saul to a young man who represented a completely different kind of king. David, a shepherd from Bethlehem, rose to prominence not through noble lineage but through charisma, courage, and divine favor, or so the later narratives would claim. His legendary victory over the Philistine champion Goliath, a story that resonates across millennia, transformed him from a simple boy into a national hero. Following a long and complex period of war and intrigue, David was anointed king, first over his own tribe of Judah, and then over all the tribes of Israel. His reign marked a decisive turning point. David was a military genius and a shrewd political operator. He did not merely defend the kingdom, he expanded it. He led a series of successful campaigns that finally broke the power of the Philistines and extended Israelite control over a vast territory, from the Euphrates River to the borders of Egypt. His most enduring and symbolic act was the conquest of Jerusalem, a fortified Canaanite city that had remained an independent enclave. By seizing Jerusalem and making it his capital, David chose a neutral site that did not belong to any single tribe, thereby creating a powerful symbol of national unity. He brought the Ark of the Covenant, the sacred chest that held the tablets of the law, to Jerusalem, cementing the city's status not just as the political capital, but as the religious heart of the kingdom. David's reign was a time of immense growth and transformation, but it was his son, Solomon, who would preside over the kingdom's true golden age. Solomon inherited a secure and prosperous kingdom, allowing him to shift the focus from military conquest to diplomacy, commerce, and monumental construction. Solomon was a masterful diplomat, forging powerful alliances with neighboring states, most notably with Hiram, the king of Tyre. This alliance granted him access to the skilled Phoenician artisans and vast quantities of cedar timber, materials that were essential for his grand architectural projects. Solomon's reign is synonymous with two great building endeavors that would forever define the kingdom. The first, and most significant, was the construction of the Temple in Jerusalem. A magnificent structure built on Mount Moriah, it was designed not just as a place of worship, but as the central sanctuary for the entire kingdom, a physical embodiment of the covenant between the people and their God. The temple was a marvel of craftsmanship and wealth, with walls paneled in cedar, intricate carvings, and vast quantities of gold and bronze. It was the crowning achievement of the united monarchy, a symbol of its power, piety, and unity. The second great project was the construction of Solomon's own palace, a sprawling complex that rivaled the finest royal residences of the ancient world. Solomon's court became a center of opulence and culture, attracting visitors from distant lands, including, famously, the Queen of Sheba, who came to test his legendary wisdom. The king's reputation for wisdom and judgment, immortalized in later texts, made him a figure of international renown. He engaged in extensive trade, establishing a merchant fleet that sailed the Red Sea and controlled key trade routes, bringing immense wealth into the kingdom. The biblical narrative describes his vast herds of horses and chariots, and the immense quantities of gold, spices, and exotic goods that flowed into Jerusalem. This era was a golden age of intellectual and artistic flourishing. With peace and prosperity, the kingdom's scribes and scholars produced a wealth of literature, including many of the texts that would later become part of the Hebrew Bible. The very act of codifying laws, composing hymns, and writing histories was an expression of a confident, self-aware nation. However, the grandeur of Solomon's reign came with a heavy price. The massive construction projects and the maintenance of a luxurious court required enormous resources, which were extracted from the people through high taxes and forced labor. The biblical account tells of Solomon levying a labor force from among all of Israel, a practice that caused widespread resentment, especially among the northern tribes who felt they bore the brunt of the burden. This social and economic stratification created deep fissures within the kingdom, undermining the very unity that Saul and David had so painstakingly forged. Solomon's later years were also marked by his embrace of foreign wives and their deities, a practice that angered the religious establishment and threatened the kingdom's monotheistic identity. The seeds of division were sown during this period of apparent prosperity and peace. The kingdom that had been so successfully united under a single king began to fracture under the weight of its own success. Solomon's death marked the end of an era. The unified kingdom, a brief but brilliant chapter in the region's history, would not survive him. The tensions between the north and south, simmering beneath the surface of Solomon's opulent court, were about to erupt, leading to a schism that would forever change the political and religious landscape of the Holy Land. The Golden Age had passed, and the sun was setting on the united monarchy, ushering in a new age of two separate kingdoms and a future of external threats and internal strife. The death of King Solomon in approximately 931 BCE did not usher in a peaceful transition, but instead ignited a firestorm of discontent that had been smoldering for decades. The immense wealth and splendor of Solomon's court, the monumental construction projects that had defined his reign, came at a staggering cost to the common people. The burden of heavy taxation and forced labor fell disproportionately on the northern tribes, who harbored a deep-seated resentment toward the centralized power in Jerusalem. With the king's passing, their long-suppressed grievances finally found a voice. The successor to the throne was Solomon's son, Rehoboam, a young and inexperienced ruler who met with the tribal elders in the northern city of Shechem. They came to him with a simple, desperate plea to lighten the heavy yoke that his father had placed upon them. Had Rehoboam listened to his elders and offered a conciliatory gesture, the kingdom might have remained intact. Instead, he chose to listen to the rash advice of his youthful companions, who urged him to be even more severe. His infamous words, "My father made your yoke heavy, and I will add to your yoke. My father also chastised you with whips, but I will chastise you with scorpions," sealed the fate of the united monarchy. The northern tribes, representing the vast majority of the population, erupted in fury. They renounced their allegiance to the house of David and chose their own king, a former official of Solomon named Jeroboam, who had been an outspoken critic of the king's policies. The single kingdom, so carefully forged by David and glorified by Solomon, was irrevocably shattered. It split into two distinct and often rivalrous entities, the Kingdom of Israel in the north and the Kingdom of Judah in the south. The Kingdom of Israel was the larger and more prosperous of the two, encompassing 10 of the 12 tribes. Its territory was vast, stretching across the fertile plains of the Galilee and the strategic heartland of the Sumerian hills. It was a land of immense agricultural wealth and a crucial link on international trade routes. However, its political history was turbulent and unstable. Without the unifying force of the Davidic dynasty, Israel suffered from a succession of bloody coups and dynastic changes. Kings and entire royal families were often assassinated, with power frequently seized by ambitious military commanders. This political volatility was a constant source of internal strife and external weakness. The northern kingdom's capitals shifted over time, eventually settling in the beautiful hill city of Samaria, which was founded by King Omri and built to be a formidable fortress and a center of commerce. Omri, a powerful military leader, established a new and influential dynasty that reached its zenith under his son, Ahab. It was during Ahab's reign that the northern kingdom truly became a regional power, engaging in military campaigns and diplomatic alliances that made it a significant player in the politics of the ancient Near East. The Kingdom of Judah, on the other hand, was much smaller and more contained. It comprised only the tribes of Judah and Benjamin, centered around the capital of Jerusalem. While it lacked the agricultural abundance and strategic importance of its northern neighbor, Judah possessed a stability that Israel could only dream of. The Davidic dynasty, despite internal squabbles and some less-than-ideal kings, remained unbroken, providing a powerful sense of continuity and legitimacy. Jerusalem, with its sacred temple and its powerful religious establishment, served as both the political and spiritual heart of the kingdom. This stability, however, came at a price, as Judah was often a vassal state to the more powerful empires of the day, a small kingdom surviving through diplomacy and tribute rather than sheer military might. The religious landscape of the two kingdoms also diverged significantly. Jeroboam, the first king of Israel, understood that a shared religious identity centered in Jerusalem could be a powerful tool for his rival kingdom. To prevent his subjects from making pilgrimages to the temple, he established two new sanctuaries, one in the northern city of Dan and the other in the southern city of Bethel. He installed golden calves in each sanctuary, declaring to the people, "Behold your gods, O Israel, which brought you up out of the land of Egypt." This act created a rival religious tradition that blended the worship of Yahweh with Canaanite religious practices, a syncretism that would be a source of constant conflict and condemnation from the prophets. The prophets, a unique and powerful force in this era, emerged as a moral conscience for both kingdoms. They were not priests, but often solitary figures who spoke truth to power, condemning social injustice, corruption, and the worship of foreign gods. In the northern kingdom, the most famous of these was Elijah, a fierce and dramatic figure who challenged the worship of the Canaanite god Baal, which had been promoted by King Ahab and his Phoenician queen, Jezebel. The stories of Elijah's miraculous acts and his confrontation with the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel are a testament to the intensity of this religious struggle, a battle for the soul of the nation. While the two kingdoms often warred with each other, They also faced a far more formidable enemy on the horizon, the resurgent Assyrian Empire. This relentless military machine, with its highly disciplined army and brutal tactics of mass deportation and conquest, began its inexorable march westward, subjugating every kingdom in its path. For both Israel and Judah, the Assyrians were a force of nature, a new geopolitical reality they could not ignore. The northern kingdom, with its political instability and fractured leadership, was particularly vulnerable. It was a time of desperate alliances and frantic attempts to appease the Assyrian kings with immense quantities of tribute. But it was not enough. In 722 BCE, after a long siege, the Assyrian army, under King Sargon II, finally conquered the capital of Samaria. The kingdom of Israel was no more. The Assyrians implemented their standard policy of conquest, a policy designed to permanently break a people's identity. They deported a massive portion of the population to distant parts of the empire and repopulated the land with other conquered peoples. This event marked the end of the 10 northern tribes, who were scattered and assimilated into the Assyrian world, becoming known to history as the Lost Tribes of Israel. Their distinct identity was erased, and their kingdom became a mere province of the vast Assyrian Empire. The kingdom of Judah, for the moment, survived. It was a vassal state, paying heavy tribute to Assyria, but its existence was prolonged by a combination of luck, shrewd diplomacy, and the steadfast belief that Jerusalem and its temple were protected by their God. The fall of their northern brethren was a profound and devastating event, a warning etched in fire and sorrow. It reinforced Judah's sense of unique destiny and its belief in the sacredness of Jerusalem, but it also placed them in a precarious and vulnerable position, isolated and surrounded by a world dominated by imperial might. The divided kingdoms had followed separate paths, and one of those paths had now reached a catastrophic conclusion, setting the stage for Judah's own struggle for survival in a world of ever-growing empires. While the northern kingdom of Israel vanished from the pages of history in a cloud of dust and deportation, the tiny kingdom of Judah clung to existence, an improbable survivor in a world dominated by the Assyrian war machine. The fall of Samaria in 722 BCE was a searing trauma, a living lesson in the consequences of political instability and religious syncretism. For the people of Judah, it solidified their belief in Jerusalem as a sanctuary, the unshakable city where the temple, the house of their single God, stood as a beacon of their unique identity. But this survival came at a heavy price. Judah was now a mere vassal state, paying immense tribute to the Assyrian Empire and forced to navigate a precarious path of submission and defiance. This fragile state of being would define the next century, a period marked by both profound spiritual revival and a desperate struggle for survival. The first great leader of this era was King Hezekiah, who ascended to the throne of Judah with a resolute vision for his kingdom. Hezekiah looked upon the fate of his northern brethren and saw a divine judgment, a punishment for their apostasy and idolatry. He believed that the only way for Judah to survive was to rededicate itself entirely to the worship of its God, Yahweh. He initiated a series of sweeping religious reforms that would be remembered for centuries. Hezekiah commanded the destruction of the high places, the local altars and shrines where the people had long worshipped in a manner mixed with Canaanite traditions. He broke the sacred pillars and cut down the sacred poles, known as Asherah, that were associated with foreign gods. His most dramatic act was the smashing of the bronze serpent known as Nehushtan, an ancient artifact that had been revered as a cultic object. His reforms were a bold attempt to centralize all religious life in Jerusalem and its temple, making the worship of one God, in one place, the singular focus of the nation. In tandem with his religious reforms, Hezekiah also began to prepare for the inevitable clash with his Assyrian overlords. He began to fortify Jerusalem, building a second wall to encompass the growing population and ensuring the city's water supply in the event of a siege. His most famous engineering feat was the construction of the Siloam Tunnel, a subterranean aqueduct that diverted water from the Gihon Spring outside the city walls to the Pool of Siloam inside, a masterpiece of ancient hydrology that remains a testament to his foresight. His defiance culminated in a revolt against Assyria, an act of faith that would be tested in the most dramatic fashion. In 701 BCE, the Assyrian king Sennacherib led his colossal army on a campaign to crush Hezekiah's rebellion and punish Judah for its defiance. He swept through the land, conquering city after city until he laid siege to the capital itself. The Assyrian army was an overwhelming force, a juggernaut that had never been defeated. The cuneiform inscriptions on the Sennacherib prism, an artifact housed in the British Museum, proudly recount how the Assyrians shut up Hezekiah in Jerusalem, his royal city, like a bird in a cage. The situation was dire. Yet, a miraculous turn of events unfolded. The Assyrian army, camped outside the walls of Jerusalem, was struck by a mysterious plague. The siege was lifted, and Sennacherib was forced to retreat, leaving Hezekiah and his city intact. This information has not been verified, but is what the later narratives would claim. This event, a profound and inexplicable deliverance, forever cemented Jerusalem's status in the minds of the people as a divinely protected city. For a time, it seemed that the reformers were right. Faith in the one God had saved them from the greatest empire on earth. This belief, however, would be tested again. After Hezekiah, there was a period of apostasy and decline under kings who reversed his reforms, but the memory of his deliverance lingered. The Assyrian Empire, in time, began to weaken and fade, giving way to the rising power of a new and equally fearsome empire, the Neo-Babylonian Empire. Under the command of the brilliant and ruthless Nebuchadnezzar II, Babylon embarked on a new wave of conquest that would once again place Judah in a precarious position. The final king to attempt a true reform was Josiah, a righteous king who, like Hezekiah, sought to restore the worship of Yahweh. His reign is famous for the discovery of a book of the law during a renovation of the temple. This discovery sparked a national religious revival, an attempt to return to the core tenets of the covenant, and a profound spiritual cleansing of the land. Josiah purged the kingdom of all remaining idols, pagan shrines, and foreign religious practices, attempting to create a pure and monolithic faith. His reforms were the last, great effort to prevent Judah's impending doom, a desperate attempt to show that the kingdom had learned the lessons of Israel's fall. But it was too late. The geopolitical forces at play were too great to be swayed by a king's piety. In 609 BCE, Josiah tragically died in battle at Megiddo while attempting to intercept an Egyptian army marching to assist the dying Assyrian Empire. His death was a devastating blow, and the brief revival he led came to a swift end. The final decades of Judah's independence were a tragic descent into chaos. Caught between the massive empires of Egypt and Babylon, Judah's last kings became puppets of one power or the other. Nebuchadnezzar II, the king of Babylon, made his intentions clear. After a series of unsuccessful revolts, he besieged Jerusalem. In 597 BCE, he took the first wave of exiles, including the royal family and the kingdom's elite, to Babylon. The city itself and its temple were spared for a time, but the writing was on the wall. The final siege began in 588 BCE, a relentless assault on the city that lasted for 30 months. The people starved within the walls, their hope and resilience draining away with each passing day. In 586 BCE, the walls were breached. The Babylonian army entered Jerusalem, and the city was sacked with unimaginable ferocity. The grand palaces of the kings were put to the torch, and the great temple of Solomon, the very heart of the nation's faith, was utterly destroyed. Nebuchadnezzar's forces carried off its sacred vessels and treasures, and the city was left a smoldering ruin. The remaining population, save for the poorest of the land, was forcibly deported to Babylon, a brutal policy of social and political annihilation. The kingdom of Judah, the last remnant of the united monarchy, ceased to exist. This event, known as the Babylonian exile, was not merely a political and military defeat. It was a profound spiritual crisis. The people had lost their king, their land, and their temple, the three pillars of their identity. It forced them to confront the most fundamental questions of their faith. How could their God have allowed this to happen? Was Hezekiah's deliverance just a fluke? Was their God defeated by the gods of Babylon? Yet, out of this despair, a new form of faith would emerge, one that was not tied to a physical place but to the very idea of a people and their sacred texts. The exile was the crucible in which the identity of a people was forged anew, setting the stage for their eventual return and a new chapter in the eternal story of the land. The journey from the smoldering ruins of Jerusalem to the fertile plains of Mesopotamia was more than a physical relocation. It was a traumatic descent into a world of forced displacement and spiritual crisis. The final deportations in 586 BC marked the lowest point in the history of the Judean people. Their city, the sanctuary of their god, was a smoking pile of rubble. Their king was blinded and led away in chains. Their holiest relic, the Ark of the Covenant, was gone, its fate one of history's enduring mysteries. The psychological and emotional impact was profound. The exiles, chained together and marching hundreds of miles to a foreign land, were a people stripped of everything that defined them. They were no longer a sovereign nation with a king and a kingdom, but a subjugated people in a strange and hostile land. They sat by the rivers of Babylon and wept, mourning for a home they had lost and for a temple that was no more. This period, known as the Babylonian exile, would become the single most transformative experience in their entire history, a crucible in which their faith was refined, their identity reshaped, and the very foundation of their religion was rebuilt from the ground up. Contrary to what the name might suggest, the exiles were not enslaved in the brutal fashion of their ancestors in Egypt. They were settled in their own communities along the canals and rivers of Babylon, particularly around the city of Nippur. They were given a remarkable degree of autonomy. They could build homes, farm the land, and engage in commerce, establishing a thriving community that, over the next 5 decades, would become a significant part of Babylonian society. The exiles produced some of their own administrative records and legal texts, demonstrating a surprising level of self-governance. But this relative freedom did little to quell their spiritual despair. They were a people without a temple, without the physical rituals and sacrifices that had been the very core of their religious life for centuries. This loss forced them to innovate, to redefine their relationship with their God in a world far from the sacred soil of Judah. This is the period where the synagogue, a new and revolutionary form of religious institution, likely emerged. It was not a temple, but a place for the community to gather for prayer, for the reading of sacred texts, and for study. The focus of religious life shifted from the bloody sacrifice of animals to the quiet devotion of prayer and the intellectual rigor of studying their covenantal law. At the heart of this transformation were the priests and scribes who had been taken into exile. They were the intellectual elite, the keepers of the old traditions, and the historians of their people. Faced with the possibility of their entire heritage being lost, they embarked on a monumental project of preservation. They gathered the disparate scrolls of laws, histories, prophetic sayings, and poems that had been written over the centuries. They edited, compiled, and standardized these texts, organizing them into a coherent narrative that explained their past, their present, and their hopes for the future. The very idea that they were a people of the book was born in the quiet houses of these Babylonian exiles. The prophetic message of this era also underwent a profound shift. The earlier prophets had warned of impending doom, but the exilic prophets, such as Ezekiel and the anonymous author of Isaiah 40 to 55, offered messages of hope and renewal. They provided a new theological framework to understand their suffering. The destruction of Jerusalem and the exile were not signs that their God had been defeated, but rather a punishment for their unfaithfulness, a painful cleansing that would ultimately lead to a restoration. This message was a powerful antidote to despair, assuring the people that their God was not a local deity tied to a physical temple, but a universal God who controlled the destiny of all nations, even the mighty Babylonian Empire. This theological leap, from a territorial to a universal God, was a monumental step forward in religious thought. The 5 decades of exile were long and often difficult, but the exiles held on to their identity with a fierce determination. They maintained their customs, their Sabbath observance, and their rituals, refusing to be completely assimilated into the rich, syncretic culture of Babylon. Their resilience was eventually rewarded in a most unexpected way. The Neo-Babylonian Empire, which had seemed invincible, began to weaken under the weight of political instability and internal strife. On the horizon, a new and powerful force was rising: the Persian Empire, led by the brilliant and charismatic Cyrus the Great. In 539 BCE, Cyrus marched his army into Babylon and conquered the city without a battle, a testament to his strategic genius and the internal decay of the Babylonian regime. Cyrus was not a conqueror in the traditional sense. His policies were radically different. He sought to win the loyalty of his new subjects not through brutal subjugation and deportation, but through tolerance and a policy of restoration. He famously issued the Edict of Cyrus, a revolutionary decree that allowed conquered peoples to return to their homelands, rebuild their temples, and worship their own gods. The document explicitly mentioned the Judean people, granting them permission to return to Jerusalem and rebuild their temple. This edict was a watershed moment, a divine intervention in the eyes of the exiles, and it brought a half-century of yearning to an end. The return, however, was not a simple or universal event. The journey back to Judah was long and arduous. For many exiles, Babylon had become their home. They had established businesses, owned property, and had been living there for 2 generations. They were comfortable and prosperous, and the prospect of returning to a land of ruins, a land they barely remembered, was not an appealing one. As a result, only a small minority of the exiles, driven by religious fervor and an unshakable belief in the divine promise, chose to make the pilgrimage back. The return was led by figures like Zerubbabel, a descendant of the Davidic line, and Joshua, the high priest. They were met not with an empty land, but with a population that had never been deported, a people who had survived the destruction and had been living on the land for decades, forming their own local traditions. The returnees, with their pure faith forged in exile, and the locals, with their pragmatic, mixed traditions, immediately created a complex and sometimes tense social dynamic. The first task of the returnees was to rebuild the temple, a project that would be fraught with financial difficulties, political opposition, and logistical challenges. The Babylonian exile, which had begun in despair, was ending in a renewed sense of purpose. But the people who returned were not the same as those who had left. They were more introspective, more committed to their sacred texts, and more defined by their faith than by their kingdom. The birth of this new, text-based faith would be the foundation of the Second Temple period, a new chapter in a story that was far from over. The Maccabean Revolt, a testament to the power of faith and rebellion, gave birth to a period of unprecedented independence and power for the Judean people. The Hasmonean dynasty, born from the fire of religious resistance, began not as a priestly-led theocracy, but as a formidable political and military state. Under the leadership of Judas Maccabeus' brothers and their successors, the Hasmonean kingdom expanded its borders with the ferocity of a conquering power. They reconquered territories that had been lost for centuries, like Samaria and the Galilee, and even forcibly converted some of the neighboring peoples to their faith, a controversial practice that blurred the line between national identity and religious coercion. This brief, glorious century of independence was a golden age for the Judean people, a time when they were masters of their own destiny, with a king and high priest of their own lineage ruling from Jerusalem. The Second Temple, now purified, stood as the center of a sovereign state, a beacon of a resurgent national pride. But this very success contained the seeds of its own destruction. As the Hasmonean rulers consolidated their power, they began to adopt the trappings of the Hellenistic kings they had so fiercely fought against. They minted coins with Greek inscriptions, built palaces and fortresses, and engaged in the same dynastic struggles and political intrigues that had characterized the Seleucid and Ptolemaic empires. The unique combination of king and high priest in one person became a source of immense corruption and moral decay. The office of the high priest, once a sacred role, became a political prize to be bought and sold. This internal strife created a deep and irreparable rift within Judean society, leading to the rise of distinct and rivalrous factions. The Sadducees, a conservative, aristocratic class, were tied to the temple and the ruling elite. They adhered to a literal interpretation of the written Torah and rejected many of the new doctrines that were emerging. The Pharisees, a more popular and scholarly group, believed in a broader interpretation of the law, including oral traditions, and sought to make the faith accessible to the common people. The Essenes, a monastic and ascetic group, retreated from what they saw as a corrupt society, living in isolated communities and awaiting the coming of a new age. These divisions turned the kingdom into a tinderbox of political and religious animosity, making it vulnerable to any external force that might exploit its weakness. That external force arrived in the form of a new, unstoppable empire rising from the west, the Roman Republic. The Romans, with their highly disciplined legions and a genius for administration, were in the process of systematically conquering the entire Mediterranean world. The Hasmonean Civil War, a brutal and destructive conflict between two feuding brothers, Hyrcanus II and Aristobulus II, provided the Romans with the perfect pretext for intervention. In 63 BCE, the feuding brothers appealed to the Roman general Pompey the Great to arbitrate their dispute. This was a fateful decision, a moment of profound short-sightedness that would cost them their independence. Pompey, recognizing the strategic importance of the region, marched his army into Jerusalem. He was not a savior, but a conqueror. After a 3-month siege, the Roman legions breached the city walls and entered the temple courtyard, slaughtering thousands of priests and defenders. In an act of profound symbolic significance and sacrilege, Pompey, a pagan, marched into the Holy of Holies, the inner sanctum of the temple where only the high priest was allowed to enter once a year. He was reportedly astonished to find it empty of any divine image, a testament to the Judean belief in an invisible, transcendent God. But his entry desecrated the sacred space and marked the official end of Judean independence. The Hasmonean kingdom was dismantled and became a Roman province. The high priest remained, but his authority was now subservient to the authority of a Roman governor. The freedom won by the Maccabees was gone. For the next few decades, the land was ruled by a succession of Roman governors and local puppets. But the true architect of this new era would be one of the most brilliant and ruthless figures in the region's history, Herod the Great. A skilled politician of Idumean descent, a neighboring people who had been forcibly converted to Judaism, Herod was a consummate opportunist. He rose to power through a combination of cunning, military prowess, and, most importantly, the unwavering backing of Rome. His reign, from 37 to 4 BCE, was a paradox of immense cruelty and unparalleled architectural genius. Herod was a brutal tyrant who murdered his own family and executed anyone who he perceived as a threat to his power, but he was also a patron of the arts and a builder of astonishing scale and vision. He understood that to rule the fiercely independent Judean people, he needed to win their hearts and minds. His greatest project, and one of the most stunning architectural achievements of the ancient world, was the massive expansion and complete reconstruction of the Second Temple in Jerusalem. He doubled the size of the Temple Mount platform, creating a vast and magnificent precinct that dwarfed the old structure. He rebuilt the temple itself, using white marble and gold, transforming it into a building of such beauty and grandeur that it became one of the wonders of the ancient world. His construction was a symbol of his desire to legitimize his rule, to show that he was a pious king in the tradition of Solomon. But Herod's building projects were also symbols of Roman power and Hellenistic culture. He built the port city of Caesarea Maritima, with its magnificent harbor and temple to Rome and Augustus, as a testament to his loyalty to his Roman masters. He built the palace fortress of Masada, a symbol of his paranoia and a refuge in case of revolt. He built the Herodium, a mountain fortress in his own burial site, a monument to his ego and his complex identity. Herod's reign was a time of immense prosperity and peace, but it was a peace enforced by the shadow of the Roman sword. His death in 4 BCE led to a predictable power vacuum. His kingdom was divided among his sons, but their incompetence and the growing discontent of the people led Rome to impose direct rule, placing the land under a series of Roman governors. The end of Herod's reign marked the end of the last semblance of Judean self-rule. The stage was now set for the most tumultuous period in the region's history, a time of rising messianic hopes, simmering rebellion, and an inevitable, tragic clash between a people's unwavering faith and the iron fist of a global empire. The death of Herod the Great brought to an end the last vestige of self-rule in Judea. The subsequent political vacuum, filled by his feuding sons and then by direct Roman administration, marked the beginning of a new and deeply contentious era. The land now fell under the direct control of a series of Roman procurators, governors who were tasked with maintaining order, collecting taxes, and ensuring the smooth flow of goods and tribute to Rome. For a time, the region enjoyed a period of relative peace and stability, a local manifestation of the broader Pax Romana, the long period of peace that Rome imposed on its vast empire. But this was a peace enforced by the presence of Roman legions, a constant and humiliating reminder of their subjugation. The Roman administration, with its pragmatic but often insensitive approach to local customs, created a tinderbox of resentment that was only waiting for a spark to ignite. The primary source of friction was not economic, but religious. The Judean people, with their fierce and uncompromising monotheism, clashed constantly with the Roman world, a world of imperial cults, pagan gods, and public spectacles that they found anathema to their faith. The very presence of a Roman garrison in Jerusalem, with its standards bearing the image of the emperor, was a profound act of desecration. The Roman officials, in turn, saw the Judean people as stubborn, fanatical, and deeply resistant to the civilizing influence of Greco-Roman culture. In this climate of simmering discontent, a wave of charismatic and messianic figures began to emerge. The people, stripped of their monarchy and living under foreign rule, were looking for a savior, a new king in the mold of David who would restore the kingdom of Israel and deliver them from the Romans. These messianic expectations were not a single, monolithic idea, but a spectrum of beliefs, from a purely spiritual redemption to a violent, political revolution. Prophetic figures and self-proclaimed saviors with large followings appeared frequently, preaching in the marketplaces and rural communities, promising liberation and a new age. This landscape of fervent hope and desperate longing provided the historical backdrop for the life of Jesus of Nazareth. He was a charismatic preacher and a healer who emerged from the Galilee, a region known for its rebellious spirit. He spoke of a kingdom of God that was not of this world, challenging the religious establishment with his interpretations of the law and attracting a large following of disciples. His message, though primarily spiritual, carried political overtones that were impossible to ignore in this environment. The Roman authorities, ever vigilant for any sign of rebellion, saw in figures like Jesus a potential threat to their control, a messianic pretender who could inspire a popular uprising. His eventual crucifixion, a brutal form of public execution reserved for criminals and rebels, was a grim testament to the Roman intolerance for any perceived challenge to their authority. This information has not been verified. The society of Judea during this period was a complex mosaic of competing factions, each with its own vision for the future. The Sadducees remained a small but powerful aristocratic group, tied to the priesthood and the temple. They were pragmatic collaborators with the Roman authorities, more concerned with maintaining their privileged position than with religious reform. The Pharisees, still the most popular and influential group, continued to uphold a strict adherence to the law, believing that a disciplined religious life would ultimately bring about the nation's salvation. But the most radical and dangerous faction in the eyes of Rome were the Zealots. They were a militant, nationalistic group who believed that the only way to achieve freedom was through armed revolt against the Roman occupiers. They saw collaboration with Rome as a betrayal of their faith and believed that God would only act on their behalf if they took up arms and fought for their freedom. A more extreme offshoot of the Zealots were the Sicarii, or daggermen, who were a group of assassins who used small daggers, or psychi, to carry out politically motivated murders against Roman soldiers and, more often, against Judean collaborators in the crowded streets of Jerusalem. Their actions were a grim symbol of the internal divisions and the growing desperation that gripped the land. The slow-burning resentment eventually reached a flashpoint. A series of inept and brutal Roman procurators, each one more corrupt than the last, systematically fanned the flames of discontent. They committed countless abuses, from seizing funds from the temple treasury to brutally suppressing peaceful protests, often leading to massacres. The final catalyst for a full-scale revolt was a combination of economic desperation and political arrogance. In 66 CE, the procurator Gessius Florus, in a blatant act of provocation, seized a large sum of money from the temple treasury, claiming it was for the emperor. His action sparked a massive riot in Jerusalem, which he brutally suppressed. At the same time, the local populace in Caesarea Maritima, a city with a mixed population, was violently attacking the Judean community. The riots, the seizures, and the feeling of utter powerlessness pushed the people to a breaking point. A band of rebels attacked the Roman garrison in Jerusalem, overwhelming the soldiers and seizing control of the city. The initial success was intoxicating. The Judean populace, filled with a sense of righteous purpose, believed that God was on their side. They had successfully driven the mighty Roman legions out of their capital. But this triumph was short-lived. A full-scale Roman army, led by the governor of Syria, Cestius Gallus, marched on Jerusalem to crush the rebellion. The Roman forces, however, were ambushed and routed at the pass of Beth Horon, a shocking and humiliating defeat for the invincible Roman army. This second victory, this time against a professional Roman force, convinced many more people that a full-scale revolt was not only possible, but divinely ordained. The entire land was now in open rebellion against the greatest empire in the world. But this momentary triumph was simply the prelude to a terrible reckoning. The Roman Empire, with its vast resources and its genius for war, would not let this rebellion stand. The stage was set for a brutal, protracted conflict that would not only destroy a nation, but forever change the course of its history and the history of the entire Western world. The seeds of revolt had been sown, and now the harvest would be reaped in blood and fire. The initial, intoxicating taste of victory, where a determined band of rebels had defied and repelled the Roman legions, was a fleeting moment of triumph. Rome, the master of the world, would not let such an audacious rebellion go unpunished. The Emperor Nero, upon hearing of the defeat of his general at Beth Horon, understood the gravity of the situation. This was not a minor insurrection. It was a direct challenge to the very foundation of Roman authority, and the response would be swift, overwhelming, and merciless. He entrusted the command of the campaign to his most trusted and experienced general, Titus Flavius Vespasianus, a man whose name would forever be etched into the memory of the Judean people. Vespasian was a seasoned military leader with a reputation for both ruthlessness and tactical brilliance. He was not a man to be trifled with, and he arrived in Judea with a massive force of 3 full legions, supported by thousands of auxiliary troops and local allies, a military juggernaut of over 60,000 men. The rebellion, which had seemed so promising in its infancy, was about to be crushed by the full might of an empire. The first phase of the war was a methodical and brutal campaign of reconquest. Vespasian's legions systematically swept through the land, besieging city after city and fortress after fortress. The Roman military machine was a marvel of organization and engineering, and the Judean rebels, for all their courage and zeal, were simply outmatched. The Romans employed sophisticated siege engines, catapults that hurled massive stones, and siege towers that dwarfed the city walls. They were a force that no ancient city could long resist. The rebel forces, though they fought with a desperate ferocity, were pushed back relentlessly into the heart of the land. The Galilee, the heartland of the rebellion, fell after a series of bloody sieges, and the Roman noose began to tighten around Jerusalem. But the greatest enemy of the rebels was not outside the walls, but within them. As the Roman legions closed in, the various factions of the rebellion, the Zealots, the Sicarii, and others, descended into a bloody civil war of their own. They fought each other in the streets of Jerusalem, burning each other's food supplies and slaughtering their rivals in a horrifying display of fratricidal violence. The great historian of the war, Josephus, who was present at the siege and a commander on the rebel side before defecting to the Romans, chronicled this self-destructive chaos with a palpable sense of tragedy. The rebels, he wrote, were so consumed by their internal conflicts that they became their own worst enemy, weakening the city's defenses and ensuring its ultimate destruction long before the Romans had even fully arrived. This information has not been verified, The Roman campaign was suddenly interrupted by a series of political upheavals back in Rome. In 69 CE, the year of the four emperors, Nero committed suicide, plunging the empire into a brief but bloody civil war. Vespasian, a man of humble origins but immense ambition and skill, was proclaimed emperor by his legions and marched to Rome to secure the throne. He entrusted the command of the siege of Jerusalem to his son, Titus, who was just as capable and ruthless as his father. Titus arrived in 70 CE with a renewed sense of purpose and a fresh army, determined to bring the war to a swift and decisive end. He positioned his forces around the entire perimeter of Jerusalem, a city with 3 concentric walls, making it one of the most heavily fortified cities in the ancient world. The Roman siege was a methodical masterpiece of military engineering. Titus ordered the construction of a massive circumvallation wall, a trench and rampart that completely encircled the city, preventing anyone from leaving or entering. This was an act of total war, designed to starve the city into submission. The siege was a nightmare of unimaginable suffering. Inside the walls, the population, already decimated by the internal conflicts, now faced a new and terrible enemy: famine. The people were reduced to eating rats, leather, and even, according to some grim accounts, their own children. Disease spread like wildfire through the packed streets, and the sight of emaciated bodies littering the alleys became a grim new reality. The Roman assault was relentless. Using massive battering rams and catapults, they began the methodical process of breaching the city's walls. The first 2 walls fell relatively quickly, but the third and final wall, the one protecting the Temple Mount and the city's inner core, proved to be a far more difficult challenge. The fighting was brutal and hand-to-hand, a desperate and bloody struggle for every inch of ground. The rebels, knowing they had nothing left to lose, fought with a suicidal bravery that surprised and impressed even the Roman soldiers. But courage was no match for Roman discipline and military superiority. On the 17th day of the Hebrew month of Tammuz, the Romans finally breached the walls of the inner city and began their final, horrifying assault. The battle for the temple itself was the climax of the war and the single most tragic event in the history of the Jewish people. Despite Titus's supposed orders to preserve the magnificent structure, a Roman soldier, fueled by the chaos of battle, threw a torch into the temple, and it quickly caught fire. The fire spread with incredible speed, and the magnificent Second Temple, the crowning architectural achievement of Herod and the spiritual heart of the nation for over 500 years, was consumed in a raging inferno. The sight of the temple burning, a pillar of smoke and fire rising to the heavens, was a moment of profound spiritual and national catastrophe. The destruction of the temple was not just the end of a building, it was the end of a religious era. The fire raged for days, and when it finally subsided, the Romans systematically leveled the entire structure, leaving not one stone upon another, just as Jesus himself had reportedly prophesied decades earlier. The Romans then proceeded to sack the rest of the city, slaughtering thousands and taking tens of thousands more as slaves. The city was left a smoldering ruin, its walls torn down, its palaces and homes reduced to ashes. The Great Revolt had been crushed, and the cost was immeasurable. The destruction of Jerusalem and its temple was a defining moment, a pivot point in the history of the Jewish people. It marked the end of the Second Temple period and the beginning of an era of dispersion and statelessness that would last for nearly 2 millennia. The few remaining rebel strongholds, such as the fortress of Masada, would fall in the years to come, but the fate of the nation was sealed on that terrible day in 70 CE. The Roman triumph, commemorated by the Arch of Titus in Rome, which depicts the plunder taken from the temple, was a bitter end to a noble and tragic struggle. The people were scattered, their religious life fundamentally transformed, and their very existence was now tied not to a land, but to a book and a memory. The year 70 CE was not the end, but the beginning of a profound transformation. The Roman legions, having crushed the Great Revolt and leveled the magnificent temple, stood victorious over a nation in mourning. The land was devastated, its cities were in ruins, and its people were scattered, with many thousands either slaughtered or taken into slavery. The physical landscape of Judea was irrevocably altered, but the spiritual and cultural landscape was changed even more. The destruction of the temple, the heart of their religious life for over 5 centuries, was the single greatest catastrophe to befall the Judean people. It marked the end of the sacrificial cult, the priesthood, and the Sadducee establishment. The very fabric of their religion, which had been so intrinsically tied to a physical place and a system of ritual sacrifice, was torn asunder. The people were left with an existential question. What does it mean to be a people of God without a temple, without a land, and without the hope of a king? The Roman Empire, for its part, sought to consolidate its control over the now pacified province. It imposed a crushing new tax, the Fiscus Judaicus, which was levied on all Jews throughout the empire, a humiliating tribute that was used to fund the temple of Jupiter Capitolinus in Rome, a direct and constant reminder of their defeat. Jerusalem, the once holy city, was a garrisoned town, its streets patrolled by Roman soldiers, and its spiritual heart a desolate plain. Yet, out of this great despair, a new form of faith, resilient and adaptable, began to emerge. With the priesthood and temple rituals gone, the religious leadership passed to the Pharisees, whose emphasis on the synagogue, the study of the Torah, and the application of law to everyday life became the new core of the religion. The destruction of the temple was a catastrophe for the priestly class, but it was a moment of opportunity for the scribes and rabbis. A school of rabbinic thought was established in the coastal town of Jabna, led by the brilliant Rabbi Yohanan ben Zakkai, who, according to later tradition, had escaped Jerusalem during the siege. In Jabna, the rabbis gathered to preserve and reinterpret the laws, to adapt the faith for a life without a temple. This monumental act of intellectual and spiritual preservation gave birth to what would become Rabbinic Judaism, a religion that was portable, intellectual, and community-centered. The focus of religious life shifted from the physical rituals of the temple to the intellectual rigor of studying sacred texts, ensuring that the faith could survive anywhere its people were scattered. The scrolls of the Torah became the new sanctuary, and the synagogue, a simple place for prayer and study, became the new center of religious life. This was a revolution, quiet but profound, that would ensure the survival of the people for millennia. For many, however, the memory of the revolt was not a lesson in adaptability, but a call for vengeance. The messianic hopes that had fueled the first rebellion did not die with the temple. They simply went underground, waiting for the right moment and the right leader to emerge. The next 60 years were a period of simmering resentment and a fragile peace. The Judean people were a defeated populace, but they were not broken. They clung to their traditions, their laws, and their unwavering belief in a future redemption. This tension reached a boiling point during the reign of the Roman Emperor Hadrian, a man of immense vision and imperial ambition. Hadrian, a great lover of Greek culture, had a plan for Jerusalem. He would rebuild it not as a Jewish city, but as a glorious pagan metropolis, a Roman colony named Aelia Capitolina, complete with a temple to Jupiter on the site of the destroyed Jewish temple. To add insult to injury, he also issued an imperial decree banning circumcision, a fundamental and sacred practice of the Jewish faith. These two acts were a final, intolerable assault on the very identity of the Judean people, a clear sign that Rome intended to systematically erase their religious and national character from the face of the earth. The response was swift and furious. In 132 CE, a charismatic and messianic figure named Simon Bar Kokhba emerged as the leader of a new and far more organized rebellion. He was a formidable military commander who, unlike the leaders of the first revolt, managed to unite the disparate factions and command the unwavering loyalty of the people. He was even hailed as a messiah by the most revered rabbi of the time, Rabbi Akiva, who saw in him the long-awaited liberator of Israel. The revolt, known as the Bar Kokhba Revolt, was a meticulously planned and highly successful guerrilla campaign. The rebels, using a vast network of hidden caves and underground tunnel systems, were able to strike with devastating effect at the Roman legions, surprising them and then melting back into the countryside. For a brief and brilliant period, Bar Kokhba's forces were able to drive the Romans out of Jerusalem and establish an independent Judean state. They minted their own coins, inscribed with slogans of freedom and the promise of a restored kingdom, a powerful symbol of their short-lived sovereignty. But this taste of freedom was tragically brief. The Roman response was even more brutal and massive than the first. Emperor Hadrian, faced with a rebellion of an unprecedented scale, was forced to recall his most skilled generals and legions from across the empire, a force that numbered over 120,000 men. The Roman campaign against the Bar Kokhba rebels was not a conventional war, but a war of attrition and scorched earth. They systematically destroyed every village and town that supported the rebellion, leaving a trail of death and desolation in their wake. They hunted down the rebels in their underground tunnels, smoking them out and slaughtering them without mercy. The final act of the rebellion came with the siege of the fortress of Bitar, where Bar Kokhba and his remaining forces made their last stand. The fortress was eventually breached, and Bar Kokhba was killed, bringing the revolt to a bloody and decisive end. The human cost of this second war was even greater than the first. Hundreds of thousands of Judeans were killed, and even more were sold into slavery. The Romans were so thorough in their devastation that the very name of the land was changed from Judea to Syria Palestina, a deliberate act of political erasure designed to wipe the memory of the Jewish people from the land. The Emperor Hadrian also issued a decree that permanently banned all Jews from entering Jerusalem. This final, catastrophic defeat marked the end of any hope for a sovereign, independent state in the ancient world. The people were scattered across the Roman Empire, their presence in their ancestral homeland reduced to a small, isolated minority. The long, tragic story of Jewish self-rule had come to an end, and the long, difficult chapter of the diaspora was about to begin in earnest. The eternal story of a people would now be carried not in a land, but in their memory, their books, and their faith. The final echoes of the Bar Kokhba revolt faded into a desolate silence, leaving behind a land scarred by war and a people scattered to the four corners of the Roman world. The province, now officially and symbolically renamed Syria Palestina, was a testament to Roman dominance and an end to the hopes of a sovereign Jewish state. The Jewish population, once the overwhelming majority, was now a small, often persecuted minority in their ancestral homeland. Jerusalem itself was a foreign city, a Roman colony named Aelia Capitolina, its streets lined with pagan temples, and its sacred soil forbidden to the people who had built it. The old Temple Mount, once the spiritual heart of the world, was a barren ruin, deliberately left that way as a grim reminder of Roman power. The period that followed was one of profound change, a long, quiet era in which the political and cultural landscape of the land was reshaped by forces far beyond its borders. The Roman Empire, the seemingly eternal juggernaut that had crushed all resistance, was itself beginning a slow, internal transformation. The old pagan gods and the imperial cults were losing their grip, giving way to a new and ascendant faith that had been born in this very land, Christianity. For its first 3 centuries, Christianity was a small, often persecuted sect that existed largely in the shadows of the Roman world. But by the 4th century CE, its fortunes changed dramatically. The Roman Emperor Constantine the Great, after a decisive battle, converted to Christianity and, in a series of edicts, made it the favored religion of the empire. This was a seismic event that had a profound and immediate impact on the Holy Land. For Christians, who had long revered the land as the place where their Messiah had lived, died, and was resurrected, it was no longer just a memory, but a physical and sacred place to be reclaimed. The land, which had been a remote, often troublesome province to the pagan Romans, now became the very center of the Christian world, the destination of a new kind of pilgrimage. The Emperor Constantine's mother, Helena, a woman of deep piety, made a famous pilgrimage to the Holy Land in 326 CE, a journey that would forever change the face of the landscape. She was a tireless seeker of holy sites, and her journey was a campaign of religious discovery and architectural ambition. According to tradition, she identified the sites of the crucifixion and resurrection and discovered the true cross. Whether these discoveries were historically accurate is a matter of debate, but their impact was undeniable. Under Constantine's patronage, magnificent basilicas and churches were built on these sites, transforming the landscape and establishing the land as the spiritual heart of Christendom. The Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, and the Church of the Ascension on the Mount of Olives were just a few of the awe-inspiring structures that rose from the earth. Jerusalem itself, once Aelia Capitolina, a forgotten pagan city, was reborn as a Christian holy city. The new focus was not on the Temple Mount, which remained desolate, but on the sites of the Passion of Christ, a new religious geography that supplanted the old. The city was rebuilt with a grandeur that rivaled its former glory, its streets now filled with pilgrims from all corners of the vast Roman and, later, Byzantine Empire. The land itself was filled with a new kind of settlement, the monastery. Monasticism flourished in the deserts and hills of the Holy Land, as pious men and women sought to live a life of prayer and asceticism in the very wilderness where Jesus had been tempted. Monasteries like Mar Saba, St. George of Kozeba, and St. Catherine's in the Sinai became centers of scholarship, spirituality, and art, preserving ancient texts and producing exquisite mosaics and illuminated manuscripts. The Holy Land was now a mosaic of Greek-speaking priests, Latin-speaking pilgrims, Syrian and Coptic monks, and a small, resilient Jewish population. For the Jewish people, this new era presented a complex and often difficult reality. They were no longer living under pagan Roman rule, but under a Christian empire that, while rooted in their own spiritual heritage, was also often hostile to their very existence. The laws of the Byzantine Empire were not always favorable to the Jews. They were prohibited from entering Jerusalem, except for a brief, once-a-year pilgrimage on Tisha B'Av, the day of mourning for the temple's destruction. They were a minority in their own land, their synagogues and communities a small part of a vast Christian landscape. Yet, they endured, preserving their traditions and their faith in the small pockets of the land where they were still a presence, primarily in the Galilee and in other rural areas. Their existence was a quiet, stubborn act of cultural and religious survival. The Byzantine period was not one of uninterrupted peace. In the early 7th century, a new power rose from the east. The Sasanian Persian Empire, under the command of King Khosrow II, invaded the Byzantine Empire and conquered the Holy Land in 614 CE. This was a moment of profound hope and expectation for the Jewish population, who had long suffered under Byzantine rule. They saw the Persians as liberators and even fought alongside them, hoping that this new power would allow them to rebuild the temple. Their hopes, however, were tragically short-lived. The Persians, after a brief occupation, were eventually driven out by the Byzantine Emperor Heraclius, who recaptured Jerusalem in 629 CE and restored Christian control. The brief period of Jewish restoration was brought to an abrupt and brutal end. The Persians were gone, but the Byzantine Empire was now weakened and exhausted by decades of war. The stage was set for the final act of this era, and for the arrival of a new force that would change the destiny of the land forever. From the deserts of Arabia, a new faith and a new people were rising, a force that would sweep away the old empires and inaugurate a new chapter in the eternal story of the Holy Land, a new era in which Jerusalem would become holy to a third great faith. The Byzantine Empire, exhausted and weakened by decades of grinding warfare against its Persian rival, was a colossus with feet of clay. Its victory over the Sasanian Empire in the early 7th century was Pyrrhic, leaving it vulnerable and overstretched. In the deserts of the Arabian Peninsula, a new and transformative force was rising, a power that would sweep away the old empires and reshape the geopolitical map of the world. Under the inspired leadership of the Prophet Muhammad, a new faith, Islam, was born, unifying the disparate tribes of Arabia into a single, cohesive force driven by a revolutionary sense of purpose. After the Prophet's death, the momentum of this new faith did not wane, it accelerated. The armies of the Caliphate, a new kind of empire that was both political and religious, exploded out of Arabia with a speed and ferocity that was unprecedented. They were not merely a conquering army, but a movement of people driven by a new belief and a sense of divine mission. The Byzantines and the Persians, still reeling from their own wars, were utterly unprepared for this new threat. Their old, tired armies were no match for the speed, mobility, and religious fervor of the Arab armies. The Arab conquest of the Holy Land was not a single, decisive battle, but a systematic campaign of conquest that began in the 630 CE. The fate of the region was effectively sealed in the year 636 CE, at the Battle of Yarmouk, a decisive and cataclysmic confrontation that took place on the plains near the Yarmouk River. The Byzantine army, a massive force of tens of thousands of soldiers from various regions of the empire, was utterly routed by a smaller, more disciplined Arab force. The battle was a strategic masterpiece for the Arabs and a complete disaster for the Byzantines. It marked the end of Byzantine rule in the Levant and opened the door for the conquest of the major cities. The cities of the Holy Land, now isolated and with no hope of a relief force, began to surrender one by one. The final and most significant surrender was that of Jerusalem. In 637 CE, after a brief siege, the city's patriarch, Sophronius, agreed to surrender to the second caliph, Umar ibn al-Khattab. This was a moment of immense historical and symbolic importance. Umar, in an act of respect and tolerance that set the tone for much of early Islamic rule, did not enter the city as a conquering king, but as a humble pilgrim. He reportedly entered on foot, clad in simple garments, and famously made a pact with the city's Christian population, guaranteeing their safety, their places of worship, and their freedom to practice their religion. This promise of protection, known as the Covenant of Umar, established the status of Christians and Jews as dhimmis, or protected people, who were allowed to practice their faith in exchange for a special tax known as the jizya. This policy of religious tolerance, though imperfect and subject to change over time, was a remarkable feature of early Islamic rule and allowed the Christian and Jewish communities of the Holy Land to endure and survive. Under the rule of the Umayyad Caliphate, 661 to 750 CE, and later the Abbasid Caliphate, 750-1258 CE, the Holy Land was no longer a remote Byzantine province, but an integral part of a vast, global empire. The new rulers, based first in Damascus and later in Baghdad, had a different relationship with the land and its holy sites. For them, Jerusalem was not just the place of Jesus' ministry and death, but a city of immense spiritual significance in Islam, a place hallowed by their own prophet's journey. According to Islamic tradition, the Prophet Muhammad ascended to heaven from the very rock on the Temple Mount, an event known as the Miraj. To honor this event, and to stake their claim to Jerusalem as a sacred city, the Umayyad caliphs embarked on a monumental building project that would permanently alter the city's skyline. On the desolate and revered Temple Mount, a site that had been deliberately left in ruins for centuries, they built two of the most magnificent structures in the history of Islamic architecture. The Dome of the Rock, completed in 691 CE, was a beautiful, octagonal building with a golden dome, built to enclose the rock from which Muhammad was said to have ascended. It was not a mosque in the traditional sense, but a powerful architectural and theological statement. Next to it, they built the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which became a major center for Muslim worship. These two structures fundamentally redefined the spiritual geography of the city, placing it firmly at the heart of the Islamic world. This period was a golden age for the Holy Land. It became a thriving hub of commerce, art, and intellectual exchange, a vibrant part of a massive trade network that connected the Muslim world from Spain to India. The old Roman and Byzantine roads were once again filled with traders, scholars, and pilgrims. The coexistence of the three major faiths, though not without its tensions and challenges, was a remarkable feature of the era. The Jewish and Christian communities, though they were no longer the dominant powers, were able to flourish. Their religious life and institutions continued, and they became a part of a multicultural society that was generally tolerant and often prosperous. The land, which had been a battleground for centuries, now enjoyed a long period of relative peace and stability. But no empire is eternal. The Abbasid Caliphate, after a period of immense growth and intellectual flowering, began to decline. Its vast empire started to fragment, as regional dynasties and independent rulers asserted their power. The central authority in Baghdad weakened, and the Holy Land, once again, found itself on the frontier of a shifting political world. The long peace was beginning to fray. The fragmentation of the Islamic world, coupled with the rise of new, aggressive Turkish dynasties, would eventually create an opportunity for a new and unexpected external force to emerge from the West, a force that would once again plunge the Holy Land into a period of chaos, bloodshed, and religious war. The centuries of Islamic rule, which had transformed the region into a center of global civilization, were drawing to a close, setting the stage for the arrival of the Crusaders. The long peace of the Islamic Golden Age in the Holy Land began to unravel in the 11th century. The unified power of the Abbasid Caliphate had long since fractured, giving way to a chaotic patchwork of independent and often rivalrous dynasties. The arrival of the Seljuk Turks, a new, powerful, and more aggressive force from Central Asia, brought an end to the era of stable, tolerant rule. They conquered the region and, with their focus on military expansion, disrupted the traditional routes of Christian pilgrims who had long traveled freely to the holy sites. For the Christians of Europe, the harassment and occasional persecution of pilgrims, coupled with the Byzantine Empire's desperate pleas for military aid against the Turks, provided the perfect pretext for a massive military and religious campaign. This movement, unprecedented in its scale and fervor, was launched by Pope Urban II in 1095 at the Council of Clermont, where he issued a fiery call to arms to reclaim the Holy Land from Muslim rule. He promised spiritual absolution for all who took up the cross and marched to the east. This was the birth of the Crusades, a series of holy wars that would plunge the land into 2 centuries of brutal conflict and leave an indelible mark on its history. The First Crusade was a shocking and violent success. Comprised of a massive, undisciplined, but fanatically motivated force of European knights and commoners, the Crusaders marched across Anatolia and down the coast of the Levant, conquering city after city with a ferocity that stunned the fragmented Muslim world. The climax of their campaign came in 1099, with the siege and conquest of Jerusalem. The city, which had peacefully surrendered to Caliph Umar centuries earlier, was now subjected to a bloody and merciless massacre. The Crusader army, driven by a religious zealotry that saw no distinction between combatants and non-combatants, slaughtered the city's Muslim and Jewish populations in a horrifying bloodbath. This conquest and its accompanying atrocities were a profound trauma for the Muslim world, creating a deep-seated legacy of bitterness and hostility that would fuel the coming centuries of conflict. The Crusaders, having conquered the city, established a new political reality in the land. The Crusader states, a collection of feudal kingdoms and principalities, with the Kingdom of Jerusalem at its heart. For the first time in over 4 centuries, the Holy Land was ruled by a foreign, Christian power, a strange and exotic European kingdom superimposed on a multi-ethnic, multi-religious population. The Crusaders built magnificent castles and fortified cities, architectural marvels of military engineering that dotted the landscape, serving as both symbols of their power and bulwarks against a hostile world. Life under Crusader rule was a complicated affair. The Crusaders were a small, foreign ruling class who relied on a system of feudal vassalage to maintain their control. They were a military elite, with a culture, language, and religion that was completely alien to the vast majority of the local population. While they allowed the local Christians to continue to worship, their relations with the Jewish and Muslim populations were often fraught with tension and outright hostility. The Crusader period was not one of peace, but a constant state of low-level warfare, with the Crusader states always on the defensive, a fragile Christian island in a sea of increasingly hostile Muslim powers. The Muslim response to the Crusades was initially fragmented and ineffective. The Muslim world, broken into petty dynasties and regional rulers, was too busy fighting itself to mount a unified defense against the invaders. But that would eventually change with the rise of a single, unifying force, a brilliant military commander and statesman whose name would become synonymous with the Muslim reconquest of the Holy Land: Salah al-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, or Saladin. A Kurdish general from a humble background, Saladin rose through the ranks of the Fatimid and Zingid dynasties to become the ruler of Egypt and Syria. He was a devout Muslim, but also a man of immense political pragmatism and military genius. His ultimate goal was to unify the Muslim world under his banner and drive the Crusaders out of the Holy Land forever. Saladin's rise to power was a campaign of cunning diplomacy and military conquest, a gradual process of bringing the fractured Muslim world under his control. Once he had achieved this, he turned his full attention to the Crusaders. In 1187, he led his unified army into a decisive confrontation with the combined forces of the Crusader states at the Battle of Hittim. It was a total, overwhelming victory for Saladin. The Crusader army was completely destroyed, its knights captured, and its king taken prisoner. The victory was a turning point, a catastrophic defeat for the Crusaders from which they would never fully recover. The path to Jerusalem was now open. Saladin, with his victorious army, marched on the city. After a short siege, the Crusaders, knowing they had no hope of a relief force, surrendered. But Saladin's conquest was not a repeat of the brutal slaughter of 1099. In a remarkable display of magnanimity and religious tolerance, Saladin allowed the Christian population to leave the city in peace in exchange for a ransom. He protected their holy sites, allowing Christian pilgrims to visit them, and cemented his reputation in both the Muslim and Christian worlds as a just and merciful conqueror. The city, which had been under Crusader control for 88 years, was once again in Muslim hands. The loss of Jerusalem ignited the Third Crusade, a massive military response from Europe led by three of its most powerful monarchs: Emperor Frederick Barbarossa of Germany, King Philip II of France, and King Richard the Lionheart of England. It was a legendary campaign, a clash of two great military leaders, Saladin and Richard. But for all their brilliant military campaigns and personal rivalry, the Crusaders were never able to retake Jerusalem. The Third Crusade ended in a truce, with Richard and Saladin agreeing to a treaty that allowed Christian pilgrims to visit the holy sites in peace. The Crusader presence in the Holy Land, though it would linger for another century, was now a shadow of its former self, a few coastal cities and isolated castles. The final chapter of the Crusader era was brought to a close not by Saladin, but by a new and powerful force that rose from Egypt: the Mamluk Sultanate. The Mamluks, a military slave dynasty, were a formidable fighting force who were determined to cleanse the land of all foreign presence. They systematically conquered the remaining Crusader strongholds, with the last one falling in 1291. The Crusades were over, a violent and temporary interruption in the long history of Muslim rule, but their legacy of religious war and cultural animosity would linger for centuries, setting the stage for a new era of stability under the Mamluks and, eventually, the arrival of the mighty Ottoman Empire. The final echoes of the Crusades faded not with a great battle, but with the quiet, methodical consolidation of power by the Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt, a dynasty of military slaves who had risen to become formidable rulers. The Mamluks brought a new era of stability to the Holy Land. They were a fiercely Sunni Muslim regime, and under their rule, the land was definitively cleansed of all Crusader presence. They were not great builders on the scale of the Umayyads, but they were great restorers, revitalizing the cities and fortifying the coastal areas against any future foreign incursions. The Mamluks, with their focus on military strength and a strict adherence to Islamic law, ensured that the Holy Land was a stable and prosperous part of their empire for over 250 years. But like all empires, the Mamluk Sultanate eventually fell into decline, weakened by internal strife and the changing tides of global trade and warfare. On the horizon, a new and even greater power was rising, a force that would consolidate a vast empire and bring the Holy Land into its final pre-modern chapter: the Ottoman Empire. A small Turkish state that began in Anatolia, the Ottomans had, by the 16th century, grown into a colossal empire that spanned 3 continents, from the Balkans to the gates of Vienna. Their conquest of the Holy Land in 1516 to 1517, under the brilliant and ruthless Sultan Selim I, was a swift and decisive campaign that brought an end to Mamluk rule and inaugurated a new era of peace and stability that would last for 4 centuries. The Ottoman conquest was, for the most part, a peaceful one. The local populace, tired of the constant strife of the late Mamluk period, largely welcomed the new rulers, who promised a return to order and prosperity. The Holy Land was now a part of a vast, well-organized empire with its capital in Constantinople. The initial decades of Ottoman rule were a golden age for the land. Its status as a holy site for all three monotheistic religions was not only respected but actively encouraged. Pilgrims from all corners of the empire and beyond once again filled the roads, and the cities of Jerusalem, Hebron, Bethlehem, and Nazareth flourished as centers of religious devotion. The most significant and lasting architectural legacy of this period came from one of history's greatest rulers, Suleiman the Magnificent, a man of immense vision and an architectural patron of the highest order. He saw the Holy Land not just as a part of his empire, but as a sacred trust. Under his patronage, the city of Jerusalem was reborn. He commissioned the rebuilding of the city's magnificent walls, the very walls that stand to this day and define its iconic skyline. He also restored and beautified the Dome of the Rock and other key structures on the Temple Mount, ensuring that the Holy City was a fitting jewel in his empire's crown. His architectural projects were not just a display of power, but a deep spiritual commitment to the land. The Ottoman administration of the Holy Land was a model of pragmatic coexistence. The empire, with its diverse population of millions, governed its non-Muslim subjects through a system known as the millet system, which granted each religious community, Jewish, Greek Orthodox, Armenian, etc., a significant degree of autonomy to govern its own affairs, including its laws, taxes, and social institutions. For the local Jewish population, this was a period of slow but steady growth. They lived in small, cohesive communities, primarily in the four holy cities of Jerusalem, Hebron, Tiberias, and Safed, and for the most part, their existence was a quiet and unremarkable part of the vast Ottoman tapestry. For the Christian population, the Ottoman era was a time of religious stability, with their holy sites protected and their pilgrimages ensured. The land itself was divided into various administrative districts, or sanjaks, and governed by local Turkish or Arab officials who were loyal to the central government in Constantinople. This long period of Ottoman rule, from the 16th to the 18th centuries, was a time of relative peace and stability, a welcome respite from the centuries of crusades and internal conflicts. It was a time when the three great faiths of the world lived side by side, their holy places protected, and their traditions preserved under the watchful eye of a distant imperial power. But like the empires that came before it, the Ottoman Empire also began a long, slow decline. By the 18th and 19th centuries, the central government's authority had weakened, and the Holy Land became a frontier of a decaying empire, a land plagued by local warlords, political instability, and an increasing sense of neglect. This decline, however, coincided with the rise of new forces from a new direction. The European powers, with their industrial and colonial ambitions, began to take a keen interest in the region. They saw the Holy Land not just as a land of religious significance, but as a strategic asset. The land was a crucial bridge between Europe, Asia, and Africa, and its control became an object of imperial competition. This new European interest brought with it new ideas and new demographics. The Ottoman period saw the first stirrings of Jewish immigration back to the land, driven by a growing sense of religious nationalism and the increasingly difficult conditions faced by Jews in Eastern Europe. These immigrants, known as the Aliyah, were a small but growing minority who sought to rebuild a new life in their ancient homeland. Their arrival marked the beginning of a profound demographic shift and the dawn of a new, complex political reality that would unfold in the 20th century. The long, unbroken chain of empires, Roman, Byzantine, Arab, Mamluk, and Ottoman, was about to be broken. The outbreak of World War I in 1914 was the final death knell for the Ottoman Empire. The British Army, led by General Edmund Allenby, marched into Jerusalem in 1917, bringing an end to 4 centuries of Ottoman rule and ushering in a new, modern era of competing nationalisms, colonial ambitions, and a renewed, and often violent, struggle for control of the Eternal Land. The ancient era of kings, caliphs, and sultans was over, and the modern story of the Holy Land was about to begin. We have journeyed through an immense and intricate tapestry of time, a chronicle spanning over 4 millennia of human history. We have witnessed the rise and fall of empires, the birth of great faiths, and the enduring resilience of a people forged in the crucible of conquest and exile. From the first seeds of civilization planted by the ancient Canaanites, through the brief but brilliant period of the United Monarchy, to the profound spiritual transformation of the Babylonian exile and the relentless march of the Roman and Ottoman empires, the land has remained a constant, silent witness to the tides of history. The story of the Holy Land is not a simple narrative of a single people, but a complex and interwoven saga of all humanity. It is a story of a land coveted by every major power, a fragile crossroads where the ambitions of kings, the fervor of pilgrims, and the daily lives of farmers, merchants, and priests have left their indelible mark. We have seen how the destruction of a physical place, the temple, did not extinguish a people's faith, but instead forced it to become more profound, more intellectual, and more portable. We have seen how the land, for centuries, became a shared sanctuary for three great religions, a place where Muslims, Christians, and Jews coexisted under the same vast skies, their holy sites a testament to a shared spiritual heritage. The long, slow burn of history, from the first mud brick villages to the final days of the Ottoman Empire, has shaped the modern world in ways that are often forgotten but are ever present. The conflicts and struggles of the past, the religious rivalries and the imperial ambitions, are not merely relics of a bygone era. They are the very DNA of the present. The walls of Jerusalem, rebuilt by Suleiman the Magnificent, still stand as a symbol of both protection and division. The Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque on the Temple Mount still stand as a testament to the layering of history and the coexistence of multiple holy sites on a single sacred space. The story of the Holy Land is an eternal story of human persistence, of the unyielding quest for a home, for meaning, and for a connection to the divine. It is a story of how a small, fragile piece of land became the spiritual center of the world, a mirror reflecting the best and worst of what humanity is capable of. It is a story that reminds us that history is not a linear march to a predetermined conclusion, but a complex, cyclical, and often contradictory process. And in the echoes of its timeless hills and valleys, we can still hear the voices of all those who came before, a constant reminder that the past is never truly past. The long era of empires is over, but the story of the land, and the people who call it home, is still being written.